Which secret military projects sound too futuristic to be real? Story 1. Project Blue Peacock sounds less like a real military program and more like the plot of an absurd dystopian science fiction film, yet it was an actual Cold War proposal developed by Britain during the 1950s, when fear of Soviet invasion pushed military planners into increasingly extreme ideas. The concept was staggering in both scale and recklessness. British officials proposed burying massive nuclear landmines throughout West Germany as a last resort defense against a Soviet advance into Western Europe. These devices were not ordinary explosives. Each mine contained a nuclear warhead powerful enough to contaminate and devastate huge areas if detonated. The idea was that if Soviet forces crossed into critical regions, the buried weapons could be triggered remotely or by timer, effectively turning sections of Europe into radioactive wastelands to halt the invasion. And that alone already sounds insane. But the truly bizarre part was the engineering problem nobody initially expected: cold weather. Military scientists worried the buried electronics inside the nuclear mines would fail during harsh European winters. Their solution was so surreal it became legendary once declassified. They planned to place live chickens inside the nuclear devices. Seriously, the chickens would be sealed within insulated compartments alongside food and water. Their body heat would keep the electronics warm enough to remain operational for roughly a week after burial. In essence, Britain briefly considered creating atomic landmines powered partially by poultry. That detail pushed Project Blue Peacock into near-mythical status because it perfectly captured Cold War logic at its most desperate and irrational. Governments became so terrified of global conflict that proposals involving buried nuclear weapons and heat-generating chickens were discussed with complete seriousness inside military planning rooms. Thankfully, the project was eventually canceled because officials realized detonating nuclear devices across Allied territory might create consequences almost as catastrophic as the invasion itself. Story 2. Project Stargate sounds like something pulled straight from low-budget science fiction. But during the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union genuinely feared that psychic abilities might become the next major battlefield advantage. And once that fear took hold, intelligence agencies started taking ideas that sounded completely insane very seriously. The Soviets reportedly poured significant resources into researching parapsychology, convinced the Americans may already have discovered ways to weaponize the human mind. Soviet-backed researchers explored claims involving telepathy, telekinesis, mind influence, remote viewing, and even the possibility of harming targets psychologically from a distance. To modern audiences, it sounds absurd. But Cold War paranoia operated on a terrifying principle. If there was even a tiny chance something worked, neither side could afford to ignore it if the other side might gain an advantage first. That fear pushed the CIA to launch its own investigations under programs like Project Stargate. Researchers worked with alleged psychics and remote viewers who claimed they could mentally perceive distant locations, secret facilities, or hidden objects without physically being there. Some experiments involved participants attempting to describe Soviet military sites, locate hostages, or gather intelligence using only coordinates and mental visualization techniques. Official reports often used calm, bureaucratic language while discussing ideas that sounded closer to supernatural fiction than military science. And that is what makes the project so unsettling. The world's most powerful intelligence agencies genuinely spent years exploring whether human consciousness itself could become a weapon or surveillance tool. Even though mainstream science never validated psychic espionage as reliable, the existence of these programs revealed how far governments were willing to go during the Cold War. At its height, global paranoia became so extreme that superpowers armed with nuclear weapons were also quietly wondering whether enemy psychics might already be spying on them through the walls. Story 3. Project Pigeon sounds so ridiculous that most people assume it has to be satire. But during World War II, the United States genuinely explored the idea of pigeons guiding missiles toward enemy targets. And somehow, the birds were surprisingly good at it. The project was developed by B.F. Skinner, the famous psychologist known for pioneering research into behavioral conditioning. Skinner believed animals could be trained to perform extremely precise tasks through reinforcement, and he proposed applying that idea directly to military weapon systems. His concept was bizarre, but technically clever. Inside the nose cone of a missile, a pigeon would sit facing a small screen displaying the target below. The bird had been conditioned to recognize images of enemy ships and continuously peck at the center of the target image. Sensors connected to the screen translated the pigeon's pecks into flight corrections, steering the missile toward its objective in real time. Essentially, the missile used a living bird as its onboard guidance computer. And against all expectations, the system actually worked during testing. The pigeons consistently tracked moving targets and corrected the missile's course with remarkable accuracy. Some military researchers reportedly became impressed by how reliable the birds were under experimental conditions. But the idea ultimately collapsed under its own absurdity. Even in the middle of a global war filled with desperate innovation, military officials struggled to trust national defense to pigeons strapped inside bombs. As electronic guidance systems advanced rapidly, the project began looking increasingly impractical and embarrassing compared to emerging technologies. Still, the fact that the United States seriously considered deploying bird-guided missiles reveals just how experimental wartime science could become. For a brief moment in history, military planners genuinely entertained the possibility that the future of precision warfare might rest inside the brain of a trained pigeon, hurtling toward enemy ships at high speed. Story 4. Lockheed SR-71. Blackbird looked so futuristic when it first appeared that many people genuinely believed it had to involve alien technology. Developed in the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, the jet was capable of flying above 80,000 feet while cruising at speeds exceeding Mach 3, more than 3 times the speed of sound. Even today, decades after its retirement, the Blackbird still feels like technology from the future. But the most unbelievable part of the aircraft was how it handled the extreme physics of supersonic flight. At those speeds, friction with the atmosphere generated enormous heat across the aircraft's body. Temperatures became so intense that engineers could not design the plane like a normal jet. Instead, they designed it to physically change shape during flight. The Blackbird's titanium airframe was intentionally built with tiny gaps and loose panel fittings while sitting on the runway. Fuel would literally leak from the aircraft at low altitude because the tanks could not fully seal when the metal was cold. Ground crews reportedly watched fuel drip from the plane before takeoff, like a malfunctioning machine. But once the aircraft accelerated toward Mach 3, everything changed. The immense heat caused the titanium structure to expand dramatically, tightening the entire airframe and sealing the gaps automatically. In essence, the SR-71 became a different machine at high speed than it was sitting motionless on the ground. That concept still sounds surreal today. A plane engineered to leak fuel on purpose because engineers knew it would reshape itself mid-air under thermal stress feels closer to science fiction than conventional aviation. And during the Cold War, seeing something like the Blackbird streak across the sky must have looked less like human engineering and more like humanity accidentally skipping several generations ahead technologically overnight. Story 5. Dead Hand system sounds less like a real military program and more like the plot of a post-apocalyptic science fiction nightmare. Yet during the Cold War, the Soviet Union genuinely developed a system designed to ensure nuclear retaliation could still occur even if the country's leadership had already been annihilated. Officially known as Perimeter, the system emerged from one terrifying fear: a surprise American nuclear strike destroying Soviet command structures before launch orders could be given. Soviet planners worried that if leadership was wiped out instantly, surviving forces might never receive instructions to retaliate, effectively allowing the United States to win a nuclear war. Dead Hand was designed to make that impossible. The system reportedly relied on a network of underground sensors capable of detecting seismic shock waves, radiation spikes, atmospheric pressure changes, and other signs consistent with large-scale nuclear detonations. During periods of extreme tension, human operators could activate the system into a standby state. And then things became truly chilling. If Dead Hand detected evidence of a nuclear attack while simultaneously losing communication with Soviet leadership, the system could automatically authorize retaliatory missile launches across the Soviet arsenal. Special command rockets would transmit launch orders directly to surviving missile silos and military units, ensuring retaliation even if human leadership no longer existed. In other words, the Soviets partially automated the apocalypse. That is what makes the project feel so dystopian even decades later. Humanity came terrifyingly close to building systems where civilization-ending decisions could continue unfolding after the people who created them were already dead. The logic behind Dead Hand was brutally rational. If nuclear retaliation became unavoidable under any circumstances, enemies would be too afraid to strike first. But the horrifying implication was equally clear. For a brief moment in history, the survival of human civilization depended partly on whether automated systems buried underground correctly interpreted the end of the world. Story 6. For decades, force fields existed purely in science fiction, glowing energy barriers protecting starships from incoming fire. Then the United States Navy quietly patented a concept in 2014 that sounded alarmingly close to the real thing. The idea revolved around creating defensive plasma shields around military vehicles and ships. Plasma, often called the fourth state of matter, is an extremely hot ionized gas capable of interacting with electromagnetic energy in unusual ways. According to the patent, bursts of plasma could be generated between a target and incoming threats using pulsed lasers, microwaves, or electrical discharges. And the effects described sound straight out of futuristic warfare. The plasma clouds could potentially disrupt incoming projectiles, interfere with sensors, blind attackers with sudden flashes of light, and create explosive shockwaves loud enough to disorient enemies. Some concepts even suggested the plasma bursts could mimic the visual signature of an explosion, tricking enemy systems into believing a target had already been destroyed. In essence, the battlefield itself could become programmable. The terrifying part is not that the Navy secretly built fully operational sci-fi shields. They did not. But that modern military technology is beginning to explore ideas once considered impossible fantasy. Directed energy weapons, electromagnetic systems, hypersonic missiles, and plasma manipulation are steadily pushing warfare closer toward concepts once reserved for movies and video games. And patents like this reveal how military research often operates years or decades ahead of public expectations. Even if the technology remains experimental, the fact that scientists are seriously studying ways to shape plasma mid-air for defense purposes shows how quickly the line between science fiction and military engineering can blur. A century ago, radar, stealth aircraft, and atomic bombs sounded impossible too. Now people casually discuss prototype plasma shields protecting warships from incoming attacks. And that realization makes the future of warfare feel both astonishing and deeply unsettling. Story 7. The sun gun concept sounds like something ripped directly from pulp science fiction. Yet Allied intelligence files revealed that German scientists during World War II seriously explored the possibility of building a colossal weapon in space, capable of focusing sunlight onto targets on Earth. The proposal was as absurd as it was terrifying. The idea involved placing an enormous curved mirror into orbit, effectively creating a gigantic magnifying glass in space. By concentrating sunlight into a focused beam, the weapon could theoretically ignite cities, destroy infrastructure, or even heat sections of the ocean to catastrophic temperatures. In essence, it was an orbital death ray powered entirely by the sun. The concept has often been linked to Hermann Oberth, one of the early visionaries of rocketry, whose work later influenced modern space programs. At the time, the engineering requirements were completely beyond what 1940s technology could realistically achieve. Launching massive structures into orbit was essentially impossible during that era. But that is not what unsettled people after the plans surfaced. What frightened historians was the sheer ambition behind the concept. Even while fighting a massive global war, military planners were already imagining weapons that extended beyond Earth itself and into outer space. The idea of weaponizing orbit decades before humans had even landed on the moon felt disturbingly ahead of its time. And today, the concept feels even more eerie. Modern militaries already rely heavily on satellites, orbital surveillance, and space-based infrastructure. While the original sun gun remained fantasy, the broader idea of space becoming a battlefield no longer sounds impossible at all. That realization gives the project its unsettling legacy. Long before humanity truly entered the space age, people were already imagining how to turn the heavens themselves into weapons. Story 8. DARPA has spent decades funding technologies that sound impossible until they suddenly become real. And one of the strangest examples was the military's push toward practical invisibility systems. During the 1990s and early 2000s, researchers explored advanced adaptive camouflage concepts designed to make soldiers, vehicles, and aircraft dramatically harder to detect. Some projects focused on active camouflage systems that could project surrounding imagery onto surfaces in real time, effectively blending objects into the environment like a technological chameleon. But the truly futuristic research involved metamaterials. These are specially engineered materials capable of manipulating electromagnetic waves in unusual ways, including bending light around objects under specific conditions. In theory, if light could be redirected perfectly around a target, the object would effectively disappear from view because observers would see only the background behind it. In laboratory settings, scientists actually managed to make tiny objects partially invisible under narrow conditions. Certain experiments successfully hid objects from specific wavelengths or viewing angles, proving the physics itself was not completely impossible. That's what makes the research so unsettling. The military was not merely fantasizing about invisibility cloaks. Scientists were actively testing the physical principles required to achieve them. Of course, reality remained far more limited than science fiction. True full-spectrum invisibility across all angles and lighting conditions remains enormously difficult. Most successful demonstrations worked only in controlled environments or against specific detection methods. Still, the existence of these programs revealed how close military science had moved toward concepts once considered pure fantasy. For centuries, invisibility existed only in myths and fiction. Then governments quietly began experimenting with materials capable of bending light itself around physical objects. And suddenly, the line between medieval fantasy and advanced military engineering started looking disturbingly thin. Story 9, Antonov A-40, sounds exactly like the kind of machine someone invents after combining military desperation with sleep deprivation. Yet during World War II, the Soviet Union genuinely attempted to turn a tank into a glider aircraft. The concept was astonishingly simple and unbelievably reckless. Instead of transporting armored vehicles by rail or building airfields closer to combat zones, Soviet engineers wondered if tanks could simply be flown directly onto the battlefield. Their solution was the A-40, a lightweight tank fitted with enormous detachable wooden wings and a tail assembly, effectively transforming it into a giant armored glider. The mission plan sounded almost comical. A heavy bomber aircraft would tow the flying tank through the sky like an oversized kite. Once approaching the battlefield, the tank would detach, glide toward the ground, land, drop its wings, and immediately drive into combat. In theory, it would allow armored forces to arrive behind enemy lines with incredible speed. And somehow, the thing actually flew. During test flights in 1942, the A-40 successfully became airborne and glided through the air exactly as intended. But there was one catastrophic problem. The towing aircraft nearly crashed, attempting to haul the massive armored vehicle. The drag and weight proved so extreme that the bomber struggled to maintain altitude and control. Pilots reportedly had to release the tank early simply to avoid disaster themselves. That moment effectively doomed the project. Even in the chaos of wartime innovation, military planners realized the idea was wildly impractical compared to conventional transport methods. Still, the existence of the A-40 perfectly captures the desperation and imagination of wartime engineering. For a brief moment in history, engineers genuinely looked at a tank and thought, what if it could fly? Story 10. The United States Navy spent decades watching laser weapons exist only in science fiction, before finally turning them into reality. What once looked like fantasy from movies and comic books is now mounted on actual warships, capable of firing concentrated energy beams at real targets. And the results are unsettlingly futuristic. In 2014, the Navy publicly demonstrated the laser weapon system aboard the USS Ponce. Later tests followed on vessels like the USS Preble. These systems were designed to destroy drones, disable small attack boats, and damage incoming threats using focused beams of energy traveling at the speed of light. No bullets, no missiles, no visible ammunition feeding into the weapon. Just concentrated energy silently burning through targets. That alone feels surreal enough, but the economics make it even stranger. Traditional missiles can cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars per launch. Laser systems, by comparison, consume primarily electrical power. Military officials famously noted that each shot effectively costs only a few dollars in energy usage, sometimes jokingly compared to the price of a cup of coffee. And unlike conventional weapons, lasers have almost no travel delay. The moment the beam fires, it hits. No recoil, no shell casings, no smoke trails arcing through the sky. Just invisible energy instantly reaching the target. The terrifying implication is that warfare is slowly shifting away from traditional mechanics humans understood for centuries. Cannons, bullets, and explosives are increasingly being joined by directed energy systems that feel closer to science fiction than historical combat. A century ago, the idea of ships firing laser beams at airborne targets sounded absurd. Now, sailors stand on the decks of real naval vessels, watching energy weapons silently ignite drones in mid-air. Story 11. The Dragonfire laser weapon system sounds like something pulled directly from futuristic space warfare, but the Royal Navy is actively preparing to deploy real laser weapons aboard warships within the next few years. And unlike science fiction, the terrifying part is how practical the technology is becoming. The Dragonfire system uses multiple high-powered fiber optic laser sources combined into a single concentrated beam capable of striking targets with extraordinary precision. Reports surrounding the project claim the weapon can accurately hit objects as small as a coin from over a kilometer away, while also engaging drones several kilometers from the ship. But precision is only part of what makes the technology feel so futuristic. Traditional weapons rely on physical ammunition, missiles, shells, explosives. Dragonfire instead attacks targets with concentrated energy traveling at the speed of light. The laser can potentially burn through materials, disable electronics, destroy guidance systems, or even detonate explosives before they reach the vessel. That fundamentally changes the nature of defense systems. Incoming drones or missiles no longer need to be intercepted physically. Instead, they can theoretically be disabled almost instantly by directed energy before impact occurs. And economically, the implications are staggering. Modern interceptor missiles can cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars each. Laser systems consume mainly electrical power, meaning each shot could cost only a tiny fraction of traditional defense methods. The unsettling part is realizing how rapidly warfare is starting to resemble science fiction. For generations, laser cannons existed only in movies and futuristic novels. Now, governments are openly installing them on operational warships, and once nations begin deploying practical directed energy weapons at scale, humanity may be entering an entirely new era of warfare, where battles are fought less with bullets and explosives, and more with invisible beams of concentrated energy moving at light speed. Story 12. High-power microwave weapons sound like something pulled from a cyberpunk battlefield, but militaries around the world are actively developing these systems as a new generation of anti-drone defense technology. And unlike traditional weapons, these devices do not destroy targets primarily through explosions or bullets. They destroy electronics. Modern warfare is becoming increasingly dependent on drones, especially autonomous swarms capable of coordinating attacks together. Small unmanned aircraft are cheap, difficult to intercept, and capable of overwhelming conventional defenses simply through numbers. Shooting down every individual drone with missiles quickly becomes impractical and enormously expensive. That is where high-power microwave weapons come in. Instead of firing physical projectiles, these systems emit concentrated bursts of radio frequency energy powerful enough to fry electronic components inside nearby targets. The effect is less like being shot and more like forcing the enemy's technology to suddenly die mid-operation. And the scale of the energy involved is staggering. Some reports describe the beams as tens or hundreds of thousands of times more powerful than ordinary household microwave systems. The weapon effectively floods an area with electromagnetic energy capable of disrupting circuits, sensors, communications, navigation systems, and onboard processors. That creates a terrifying advantage against drone swarms. Unlike lasers, which usually target one object at a time, microwave weapons can potentially disable multiple drones simultaneously if they enter the beam's effective range. Entire swarms could suddenly fall from the sky without visible explosions at all. The unsettling part is how invisible this kind of warfare becomes. No loud gunfire, no missiles streaking overhead, just silent electromagnetic pulses shutting down machines instantly. And as warfare becomes increasingly automated and network-driven, technologies capable of disabling electronics en masse may eventually become just as strategically important as bullets, bombs, and missiles once were. Story 13. The autonomous weapons system no longer belongs purely to science fiction. The idea of machines selecting and engaging targets without direct human control has already moved from futuristic movies into real-world military development. And that is exactly why so many experts find the technology deeply unsettling. Modern warfare increasingly depends on artificial intelligence systems capable of identifying threats, tracking movement, analyzing data, and reacting faster than human operators ever could. Autonomous drones, automated defense platforms, and AI-assisted targeting systems are already being tested and deployed by multiple nations. The frightening part is speed. Human decision-making introduces hesitation, ethics, communication delays, and emotional judgment. Military planners often see those limitations as weaknesses. AI systems, by contrast, can process enormous amounts of information instantly and react in milliseconds. That creates a dangerous temptation. Remove humans from the decision loop entirely. Once weapons become capable of independently identifying and attacking targets, warfare changes fundamentally. Machines no longer simply assist soldiers, they begin making lethal decisions themselves. And critics warn the consequences could become catastrophic. Researchers like Łukasz Olejnik have warned about the possibility of losing meaningful human control over engagement decisions. AI systems may misidentify civilians, escalate conflicts unpredictably, or continue operating under flawed parameters faster than humans can intervene. The truly terrifying part is scalability. Unlike human soldiers, autonomous systems can potentially be mass-produced, networked together, and deployed continuously without fatigue or fear. Entire battlefields could eventually become populated by machines hunting targets algorithmically at speeds beyond human comprehension. That possibility feels disturbingly close to dystopian fiction because humanity is slowly approaching a point where war may no longer be fought primarily by people. It may be fought by intelligent systems humans created, but may not fully control once conflict begins. Story 14. Havana Syndrome became one of the strangest and most controversial modern security mysteries because it sounded less like a real-world intelligence incident and more like invisible science fiction weaponry. Beginning in 2016, American personnel stationed in Havana, Cuba began reporting sudden episodes of dizziness, nausea, headaches, ear pain, cognitive difficulties, and intense disorientation. Some described hearing strange sounds or pressure sensations moments before symptoms appeared. Over time, similar reports emerged from officials in other countries as well, that immediately sparked fears of a covert directed energy weapon. One theory suggested some form of sonic or microwave-based system capable of targeting individuals remotely. Unlike conventional weapons, these devices would leave no obvious physical evidence while potentially disrupting hearing, balance, or neurological function through concentrated energy exposure. And that possibility terrified intelligence agencies. For decades, militaries have researched non-traditional weapons involving sound, microwaves, electromagnetic radiation, and other directed energy concepts designed to incapacitate targets without visible attacks. High-intensity acoustic systems can already cause pain, nausea, and disorientation under certain conditions. Microwave technologies have also been explored for crowd control and anti-personnel applications. The frightening part was the uncertainty. Investigators struggled to determine whether Havana Syndrome resulted from hostile technology, environmental causes, psychological factors, medical conditions, or some combination of multiple explanations. Studies and intelligence reviews produced conflicting conclusions, leaving the mystery unresolved in the public mind. And that ambiguity is exactly what makes the story so disturbing. If a hidden directed energy weapon did exist, it would represent a terrifying evolution in covert warfare. Attacks delivered invisibly through walls, air, or distance without traditional evidence. But if the symptoms emerged from something else entirely, the fact that governments and experts genuinely considered invisible neurological weapons plausible says a great deal about how futuristic military technology has already become behind closed doors. Story 15. Railgun sounds like something mounted on a spaceship in a futuristic war movie, yet militaries have spent years seriously developing the technology as a possible next evolution in artillery. And the concept is brutally simple. Instead of using gunpowder or explosives to fire a projectile, a railgun uses enormous electromagnetic forces generated between two conductive rails. When electricity surges through the system, a rapidly expanding magnetic field accelerates a metal projectile to extreme velocities, sometimes several times faster than the speed of sound. The terrifying part is that the projectile does not even need explosives. At hypersonic speeds, the sheer kinetic energy alone becomes devastating enough to destroy targets through impact. A chunk of metal traveling fast enough effectively turns into a precision meteor strike. That creates several major advantages over conventional weapons. Railgun projectiles can potentially travel far greater distances than traditional naval artillery while reaching targets incredibly quickly. Their velocity also makes interception extremely difficult because defensive systems have far less time to react. And unlike missiles, the ammunition itself can be comparatively simple. No onboard fuel, no explosive warhead, just high-speed metal accelerated by massive electrical power. That is what makes the technology feel futuristic. For centuries, warfare relied primarily on chemical explosions to launch projectiles. Railguns instead weaponize electricity and magnetism directly, turning physics itself into the propulsion system. The engineering challenges remain enormous. The weapons consume tremendous amounts of power and place extreme stress on their components due to heat and friction. Many experimental systems still struggle with durability and operational practicality. But the fact that militaries are actively pursuing electromagnetic artillery reveals how dramatically warfare is evolving. The battlefield of the future may rely less on traditional explosives and more on weapons capable of hurling projectiles across vast distances at hypersonic speeds, using little more than raw electromagnetic force. Story 16, directed energy weapons are pushing warfare into territory that feels increasingly dystopian, especially once those systems are aimed not at missiles or drones, but at people. Modern directed energy research does not only focus on destroying targets. Some systems are specifically designed to influence human behavior through pain, discomfort, heat, or sensory overload without necessarily causing permanent injury. And that is where things begin sounding unsettlingly futuristic. Certain experimental crowd control concepts use concentrated electromagnetic energy to create intense burning sensations on the skin, forcing people to instinctively move away from the affected area. Others explore acoustic or microwave-based systems capable of disorienting crowds, disrupting movement, or inducing severe discomfort at a distance. Unlike conventional riot control weapons, there may be no visible projectile at all, no rubber bullets, no tear gas canisters, just invisible energy reaching across open space and triggering pain directly inside the body. Supporters argue these technologies could offer alternatives to lethal force by dispersing crowds or stopping threats without permanent physical damage. But critics warn the implications are deeply troubling. The line between non-lethal and abusive becomes dangerously thin once governments possess weapons capable of remotely inflicting pain invisibly and silently. Questions immediately arise about misuse, escalation, authoritarian control, and what happens when systems malfunction or are deployed beyond intended limits. That is what makes these technologies feel so dystopian. They transform energy itself into a behavioral control mechanism. And as directed energy systems become more sophisticated, warfare and law enforcement may increasingly shift away from visible physical force toward invisible technologies capable of influencing the human body and nervous system directly from a distance. The frightening part is not simply the weapons themselves. It is how quickly concepts once associated with speculative fiction are becoming technically plausible in the real world. Story 17, the Outer Space Treaty, was supposed to help prevent humanity from turning space into a battlefield, but modern military technology is steadily pushing warfare higher above Earth every year. While the treaty banned weapons of mass destruction from being stationed in orbit, it left enormous gray areas surrounding other military systems. And over time, world powers quietly began exploring those possibilities. The result is the unsettling rise of orbital warfare concepts. Modern militaries depend heavily on satellites for communication, navigation, surveillance, missile tracking, and intelligence gathering. Destroying or disabling those systems could cripple entire military operations on Earth without firing a single conventional shot. That is why anti-satellite technology has become such a major focus. Countries including the United States, Russia, and China have all explored ways to interfere with, disable, or physically destroy satellites in orbit. Some systems involve missiles launched from Earth, while others involve satellites capable of maneuvering near rival spacecraft. In one particularly eerie example, Russian tests reportedly involved satellites firing projectiles in orbit. Chinese systems have also demonstrated the ability to move or reposition satellites, including dragging inactive ones into so-called graveyard orbits, far away from operational pathways. That capability may sound harmless initially, until you realize the same technology could potentially disable enemy satellites during wartime. And once nations begin weaponizing orbit, the implications become enormous. Space stops being merely a scientific frontier and becomes strategic high ground controlling communications, surveillance, navigation, and potentially future weapons platforms. The terrifying part is how invisible orbital warfare would feel to ordinary people on Earth. No dramatic invasion fleets, no giant explosions in the sky, just satellites silently disappearing, communications failing, navigation systems collapsing, and modern civilization suddenly realizing how dependent it has become on vulnerable infrastructure floating silently above the planet. Story 18. For over a century, fighter pilots have been treated like the elite warriors of modern warfare, highly trained humans making split-second life or death decisions at impossible speeds high above the battlefield. But the arrival of next-generation autonomous aircraft is beginning to challenge whether human pilots are even necessary anymore. In March 2025, the United States Air Force revealed two of its newest uncrewed fighter aircraft designs, the YFQ-42A and YFQ-44A. And unlike traditional drones remotely controlled from the ground, these systems are designed for increasingly autonomous operations. That is what makes them feel so futuristic. The aircraft are capable of flying at extreme altitudes and high speeds while performing missions without a pilot physically inside the cockpit. The YFQ-44A reportedly reaches altitudes around 50,000 feet while traveling at hundreds of miles per hour, operating more like an AI-controlled combat platform than a conventional aircraft. And once humans are removed from the cockpit, the design possibilities change dramatically. Pilots no longer need oxygen systems, ejection seats, life support equipment, or protections against extreme G-forces. Aircraft can potentially maneuver harder, react faster, and take greater risks because no human body is inside to protect. That creates a chilling possibility for the future of warfare. Dogfights may eventually stop being contests between elite human pilots and instead become battles between autonomous systems, making decisions faster than humans can process. Wars in the sky could increasingly unfold at machine speed, with artificial intelligence handling navigation, targeting, threat assessment, and tactical coordination. The unsettling part is not simply the aircraft themselves, it is what they represent. For generations, warfare still depended heavily on human judgment in the final moments of combat. But autonomous fighter programs suggest humanity may be entering an era where machines are no longer merely tools of war. They are becoming warriors themselves. Story 19. Cognitive warfare sounds like something ripped from dystopian cyberpunk fiction. Yet modern militaries and intelligence researchers are increasingly exploring ways to target not just enemy equipment, but the human mind itself. And that possibility is deeply unsettling. Reports and speculative studies surrounding so-called neurostrike concepts suggest future conflicts may involve technologies designed to impair concentration, induce confusion, disrupt sleep, alter emotional states, or weaken decision-making abilities among enemy personnel. Some discussions focus on sonic systems, electromagnetic effects, chemical agents, or other directed energy approaches intended to interfere with human neurobiology. The idea sounds unbelievable at first, but throughout history, militaries have constantly searched for methods to influence human psychology during war. Propaganda, psychological operations, interrogation techniques, chemical agents, sensory manipulation, and behavioral conditioning have all been explored in various forms. The difference now is that emerging technologies may eventually allow those effects to become more targeted, remote, and technologically sophisticated. That is where the fear comes from. Organizations and analysts have claimed certain countries may be investigating systems capable of affecting cognition or consciousness indirectly through sound, electromagnetic energy, or neurological disruption. Some modern discussions even echo Cold War-era rumors surrounding so-called psychotronic weapons, alleged technologies intended to influence mood, perception, or willpower itself. There is little hard public evidence proving such systems currently exist in the dramatic form often described. But the fact that governments and researchers seriously discuss cognitive warfare at all reveals how warfare itself is evolving. Future conflicts may not focus solely on destroying infrastructure or eliminating enemy forces physically. They may focus increasingly on disrupting human thought, perception, and mental stability directly. And that possibility feels uniquely disturbing because it transforms the human mind itself into a battlefield. Story 20. During World War I, military engineers were already imagining weapons that sounded decades ahead of their time. Among the strangest concepts developed by Britain was a flying torpedo designed to be launched from a Zeppelin-like airship and guided toward enemy warships from high altitude. At a time when aviation itself was still relatively new, the idea felt almost unbelievably futuristic. The weapon functioned as an early attempt at airborne precision strike technology. Airships could travel long distances over the ocean and approach enemy fleets from above, something traditional naval forces were not prepared for at the time. By releasing a powered torpedo from the sky, engineers hoped to create a devastating surprise attack capable of striking ships beyond the range of conventional naval guns. In many ways, it was an ancestor of modern cruise missiles. The concept relied on combining aerial deployment with self-propelled naval weaponry, effectively merging two revolutionary technologies into one system years before guided missiles became practical reality. Military planners envisioned high-altitude attacks where enemy vessels might never even see the weapon coming before impact. But there was one major problem. The technology of the era simply was not ready. World War I aircraft and airships were fragile, difficult to maneuver, vulnerable to weather, and often unreliable under combat conditions. Precision guidance systems barely existed, and coordinating airborne launches accurately proved enormously difficult. As naval warfare evolved and more practical bombing techniques emerged, the project gradually lost support. Still, the existence of the weapon reveals how quickly militaries began thinking beyond traditional warfare once flight became possible. Even during the early 1900s, engineers were already imagining airborne long-range strike systems capable of attacking from beyond visual range, concepts that would later define modern warfare. For a brief moment during World War I, Britain experimented with the idea of flying torpedoes raining from the sky decades before missile warfare officially arrived. Story 21. Waverly Death Machine sounds like the kind of absurd superweapon name invented for a pulp science fiction comic. But in the aftermath of World War I, Britain genuinely explored experimental artillery systems that promised destruction on an unprecedented scale. The early 1920s were filled with military inventors convinced the next great leap in warfare would come from increasingly massive long-range weapons. The devastation of trench warfare had already demonstrated how rapidly technology could transform combat, and engineers across Europe began proposing machines capable of striking enemies from enormous distances with overwhelming force. The Waverly Death Machine was one such concept. The system reportedly aimed to launch explosive projectiles across vast ranges far beyond traditional artillery capabilities of the era. In theory, weapons like this could bombard enemy positions, infrastructure, or cities from distances that made retaliation extremely difficult. And that was exactly what made military planners interested. Long-range bombardment represented a terrifying new direction in warfare, where destruction could arrive without warning from far beyond the battlefield itself. The psychological effect alone would have been enormous. But the technology quickly revealed major flaws. Early tests reportedly showed the weapon was dangerously unstable, difficult to aim accurately, and impractical under real combat conditions. The enormous forces involved made the system unreliable, while the lack of precise targeting raised fears it could become as dangerous to operators and surrounding areas as to intended enemies. Ultimately, the project was abandoned before it ever saw meaningful deployment. Still, the idea remains fascinating because it showed how quickly militaries began dreaming of weapons capable of delivering destruction at extreme distances decades before modern missile systems existed. The unsettling part is realizing that even in the 1920s, engineers were already imagining warfare, where death could arrive from unseen horizons through machines operating at scales previous generations would have considered impossible. Story 22. During World War II, German military scientists became obsessed with developing so-called wonder weapons, futuristic technologies they hoped would reverse the course of the war through overwhelming technological superiority. Many of these concepts sounded decades ahead of their time, blending real engineering breakthroughs with ideas bordering on science fiction. Some of the projects were astonishingly advanced for the era. Experimental jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 became some of the first operational jet-powered combat aircraft ever built. Rocket systems like the V-2 rocket introduced technology that would later influence both Cold War missile programs and modern space exploration. But beyond the practical weapons were far stranger ideas. Military researchers explored massive orbital mirrors, giant artillery cannons, vertical launch aircraft, and rumored experimental devices that later fueled stories involving anti-gravity research and even alleged time machine theories. Many of these concepts were never fully operational, existing only as blueprints, prototypes, or speculative engineering studies. And that is what makes the era so fascinating and unsettling. The desperation of wartime pushed scientists to explore technologies far outside conventional military thinking. Governments were willing to fund almost anything if there was even a slight chance it could provide a strategic advantage. After the war ended, many documents, laboratories, and prototypes were destroyed, captured, or scattered among Allied powers. Some scientists were recruited into foreign research programs, contributing to later advancements in aerospace and rocketry during the Cold War. That disappearance of information only amplified the mystery surrounding these projects over time. The result is a strange blend of historical reality and speculation, where genuine technological breakthroughs sit alongside rumors of experimental superweapons so bizarre they still sound fictional decades later. For a brief period during World War II, military engineering accelerated so rapidly that the line between science fiction and real warfare began to blur in ways the world had never seen before. Story 23. Tortoise heavy assault tanks looked less like a normal tank and more like a moving bunker built to crawl directly through enemy fortifications. Developed during World War II, the massive vehicle was designed around one terrifying idea: create an armored machine so heavily protected that almost nothing on the battlefield could stop it. And for its time, it came surprisingly close. The Tortoise weighed over 80 tons, making it one of the heaviest armored vehicles Britain ever attempted to build. Instead of prioritizing speed or mobility, engineers focused almost entirely on survivability and firepower. Its armor was extraordinarily thick, designed to withstand direct hits from enemy anti-tank weapons while advancing steadily toward fortified positions. At the front sat its enormous 32-pounder gun, a weapon powerful enough to destroy heavily armored targets and defensive structures from long distances. The tank was essentially a mobile siege engine, but that extreme design created enormous problems. The Tortoise was painfully slow, difficult to transport, and so massive that many bridges and roads could not safely support its weight. Moving it across Europe would have been a logistical nightmare even before combat began. While its armor made it incredibly difficult to destroy, its sluggish speed and enormous size also made it impractical for the increasingly mobile style of warfare emerging late in the war. By the time prototypes were completed, the conflict was already nearing its end. Only a handful were ever built, and the vehicle never saw actual combat. Still, the Tortoise remains fascinating because it represents a moment when military engineers believed the future of warfare might belong to gigantic armored behemoths capable of surviving almost anything thrown at them. For a brief period during World War II, Britain seriously experimented with turning tanks into rolling fortresses the size of small houses. Story 24. Ghost Army sounds like something out of a psychological warfare thriller, but during World War II, the United States really did assemble a secret military unit dedicated entirely to deception, illusion, and manipulation on the battlefield, and one of its strangest weapons was sound itself. The Ghost Army specialized in convincing enemy forces that massive Allied units were present, where in reality, almost nothing existed at all. Instead of relying purely on firepower, the unit used inflatable tanks, fake artillery, staged radio traffic, fabricated military camps, and sonic deception systems designed to create entire phantom armies. The audio technology was particularly futuristic for the time. Engineers recorded real military sounds, tank engines rumbling, soldiers marching, armored vehicles moving, bridge construction, and troop activity onto large audio systems mounted on trucks. Powerful speakers then blasted these recordings across long distances, sometimes audible for miles. To enemy troops listening in the dark, it sounded like enormous armored divisions were approaching. The goal was simple: confuse enemy commanders, force them to reposition troops incorrectly, and create uncertainty about where Allied attacks would actually occur. And remarkably, it worked. German forces were repeatedly misled by these elaborate illusions, wasting resources preparing for invasions and attacks that did not exist. Entire operations were protected through carefully staged deception campaigns involving sound, visual trickery, and fake communications. What makes the Ghost Army so fascinating is how modern its tactics feel even today. Long before cyber warfare or electronic misinformation campaigns, militaries already understood that controlling perception could be just as important as controlling firepower. The unit remained classified for decades after the war, adding to its almost mythic reputation once details finally emerged publicly. For a brief moment in World War II, the United States weaponized illusion itself, creating phantom armies powerful enough to fool real enemy forces into preparing for battles against soldiers who were never actually there. Story 25. The T-34 mine flail tank looked less like a conventional armored vehicle and more like a machine built for surviving apocalyptic battlefields. During World War II, Soviet engineers faced one brutal problem repeatedly: massive minefields slowing offensives and turning entire advances into deadly traps. Their solution was both simple and terrifying. Take a T-34 and attach a gigantic rotating mechanical flail to the front. The device consisted of heavy chains and metal weights mounted on a spinning drum positioned ahead of the tank. As the drum rotated, the chains violently slammed into the ground, detonating mines before the vehicle itself reached them. In action, the machine must have looked absolutely nightmarish. The spinning flail kicked up dirt, debris, smoke, and explosions, while the tank crawled forward through minefields like some kind of armored industrial monster. The entire battlefield around it erupted constantly as buried explosives detonated beneath the hammering chains. And surprisingly, the concept actually worked to some extent. Mine flail systems proved capable of clearing safe paths through dangerous terrain, allowing infantry and armored vehicles to advance behind them. Variants of the idea would continue appearing in different militaries long after the war. But the early Soviet versions also revealed major drawbacks. The flail systems were mechanically complex, extremely heavy, difficult to maintain, and vulnerable during combat. The violent impacts placed enormous stress on the machinery, while the slow-moving tanks became obvious targets for enemy artillery and anti-tank weapons. In real battlefield conditions, reliability became a serious problem. Still, the idea remains fascinating because it perfectly captures the brutal practicality of wartime engineering. Rather than carefully disarming mines one by one, engineers essentially built armored machines designed to punch the ground until the explosives detonated first. For a brief period during World War II, Soviet forces experimented with tanks that literally beat minefields into submission using giant spinning chains. Story 26. Goliath tracked mine looked like a miniature tank from the future, but during World War II, it became one of the earliest real attempts at robotic warfare on the battlefield. The idea behind the weapon was surprisingly modern. The Goliath was a small tracked vehicle packed with explosives and operated remotely through a long control wire trailing behind it. Soldiers could guide the machine toward enemy tanks, bunkers, fortifications, or troop positions from a safer distance before detonating the payload. In many ways, it was an ancestor of modern military drones. At a time when most warfare still relied heavily on direct human engagement, engineers were already experimenting with unmanned machines capable of delivering explosives without risking the operator directly. Watching one crawl slowly across a battlefield toward enemy lines must have felt incredibly unsettling for soldiers encountering it for the first time. But the futuristic concept came with major weaknesses. The Goliath moved slowly, had thin armor, and depended on fragile control wires that could easily be cut by gunfire, explosions, or rough terrain. Enemy soldiers often destroyed the devices before they reached their targets, and the small vehicle struggled in muddy or damaged battlefield conditions. The machines were also expensive and mechanically unreliable compared to the damage they typically inflicted. As warfare evolved and more effective anti-tank systems emerged, the project gradually lost military value. Still, the Goliath remains fascinating because it revealed how early militaries began imagining combat where machines, not soldiers, carried out dangerous attack missions remotely. Decades before modern drones became common, World War II engineers were already experimenting with explosive robotic vehicles crawling silently toward enemy positions under remote control. Story 27. The Bat Bomb Project sounds completely ridiculous until you realize the United States military genuinely spent time and money trying to weaponize bats during World War II. And somehow, the idea almost worked. The concept was born from the observation that many Japanese buildings of the era were constructed largely from wood and paper, making urban areas extremely vulnerable to fire. Military planners wanted a way to ignite thousands of small fires simultaneously across enemy cities. Their solution was unexpectedly creative and deeply bizarre. Tiny incendiary explosives were attached to live bats placed inside specially designed bomb casings. The containers would be dropped from aircraft at high altitude, opening mid-air to release swarms of bats over target areas. Because bats naturally seek dark sheltered spaces before daylight, planners believed the animals would scatter into rooftops, attics, and buildings throughout cities. Then the timed incendiary devices would ignite. In theory, entire urban districts could burst into flames almost simultaneously from hundreds of hidden fire sources spread naturally by the bats themselves. And early tests produced some alarming results. During one accidental incident, armed bats reportedly escaped during a military trial and ended up setting parts of an airbase on fire, proving the concept was at least technically dangerous enough to function. But the project ultimately became too impractical and unpredictable. Training, handling, transporting, and deploying thousands of explosive-carrying bats proved enormously complicated. At the same time, faster developing technologies like conventional bombing campaigns and atomic weapons rapidly overshadowed the strange experiment. Still, the project remains one of the strangest examples of wartime innovation ever attempted. For a brief moment during World War II, military scientists seriously believed colonies of explosive bats might become a revolutionary weapon capable of burning enemy cities from the inside out. Story 28. The V-3 supergun sounded less like conventional artillery and more like an attempt to build a machine capable of bombarding cities from another world. Developed during World War II, the enormous weapon was designed to strike targets at extraordinary distances, using an entirely different approach from traditional cannons. The concept behind the V-3 was incredibly ambitious. Instead of relying on a single explosive charge to fire a shell, the supergun used a multi-charge system built along an extremely long barrel. As the projectile traveled down the barrel, additional side-mounted explosive charges would ignite sequentially, continuously accelerating the shell forward like stages of a rocket. The goal was terrifyingly simple: create a weapon capable of bombarding London directly from mainland Europe. If fully operational, the gun would have fired artillery shells across the English Channel repeatedly over long periods, turning long-range bombardment into something closer to industrialized destruction. Massive underground bunkers and fortified launch facilities were constructed to support the project, reflecting just how seriously military planners viewed the weapon. But the engineering challenges proved enormous. Synchronizing the explosive charges reliably was extremely difficult, while the gigantic barrels suffered from technical instability and structural problems. Allied bombing campaigns also heavily targeted the construction sites before the weapon could become fully operational at the intended scale. In the end, only limited versions were ever used, and the original vision of sustained long-range bombardment never became reality. Still, the V-3 remains deeply fascinating because it represented a huge leap beyond normal artillery concepts of the era. Engineers were already imagining weapons capable of striking cities from incredible distances with relentless firepower decades before modern missile technology dominated warfare. For a brief moment during World War II, military planners genuinely attempted to build a cannon so massive it could attack an enemy capital from another country continuously. Story 29. During World War II, German engineers pushed rocket technology so far ahead of its time that some of their projects looked more like the beginning of the space age than conventional wartime engineering. Among the most ambitious were advanced long-range rocket systems designed to strike targets hundreds of miles away with unprecedented speed and destructive power. At the center of these developments was the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Unlike traditional bombers or artillery, the rocket traveled faster than the speed of sound and reached the edge of space before descending onto its target. Victims often heard the explosion before they ever heard the rocket itself. That alone felt terrifyingly futuristic in the 1940s. The technology behind the system laid the foundation for modern missile engineering and eventually influenced the development of space launch vehicles after the war. Scientists working on these programs later contributed to Cold War rocket programs and even early space exploration efforts. But alongside operational systems were even more ambitious concepts. Designs circulated for multi-stage rockets, intercontinental strike systems, and weapons capable of reaching targets across oceans. Some proposed vehicles resembled early versions of modern space rockets, decades before humanity had even launched satellites into orbit. And that is what made these projects so unsettling. Military engineers were already beginning to unlock technologies that would later define both the nuclear missile age and humanity's journey into space. The line between weapons development and space exploration became dangerously thin. As the war collapsed and resources disappeared, many experimental projects were abandoned, destroyed, or captured before they could fully materialize. Only fragments, prototypes, and scattered documentation survived. Still, the legacy of those rocket programs remains enormous. For a brief period during World War II, humanity accelerated from conventional artillery into the dawn of the missile and space age almost overnight. Story 30, Northrop YB-49, looked so futuristic in the late 1940s that many people who saw it believed they were witnessing aircraft technology decades ahead of its time. Unlike conventional bombers with obvious fuselages and tails, the YB-49 appeared almost alien, a massive, smooth flying wing gliding through the sky with barely any visible body at all. And in many ways, it truly was ahead of its era. Developed by Northrop Corporation, the aircraft was one of the earliest serious attempts to create a jet-powered flying wing bomber. Its unusual shape was not purely aesthetic. Engineers realized that removing unnecessary structures reduced drag, improved efficiency, and potentially made the aircraft harder to detect visually and on radar. Decades later, those same ideas would become central to stealth aircraft design. The YB-49 looked less like a World War II bomber and more like something from the modern stealth era. With its smooth blended surfaces and unconventional profile, it strongly resembled aircraft humanity would not fully operationalize until generations later. But the futuristic design came with major problems. The aircraft proved notoriously difficult to control. Without modern computerized flight systems, keeping such an unstable flying wing balanced during flight was extremely challenging. Pilots struggled with handling issues, and the aircraft's unpredictable behavior ultimately contributed to serious safety concerns. One prototype even crashed catastrophically during testing. As military priorities shifted and more practical bomber designs emerged, the program was eventually canceled, despite its revolutionary concepts. Still, the YB-49 remains one of the most fascinating what-if projects in aviation history. Long before stealth bombers officially existed, engineers had already built a jet-powered flying wing that looked like it belonged to the future. Story 31. During the Cold War, the United States explored increasingly bizarre ways to hunt enemy submarines. And one of the strangest concepts involved creating an aircraft so quiet it could approach targets with minimal acoustic warning. In an era when underwater warfare depended heavily on sonar detection, silence itself became a weapon. The classified anti-submarine project reportedly focused on reducing the enormous noise normally produced by military aircraft. Engineers experimented with advanced soundproofing methods, modified engine systems, vibration reduction, and stealth-inspired design concepts intended to minimize how much sound reached the ocean below. The goal was deeply futuristic for the 1950s. Conventional anti-submarine aircraft were loud and relatively easy for submarine crews to detect indirectly through sonar and acoustic monitoring. A quieter aircraft, however, could potentially approach much closer before enemy operators realized they were being hunted. That would create a terrifying tactical advantage. The aircraft could search for submerged submarines, deploy torpedoes or depth charges, and attack before the target had enough warning to evade effectively. In many ways, the project foreshadowed the broader stealth revolution that would later reshape aerial warfare. And that is what makes the concept so fascinating. Long before stealth bombers became public knowledge, military engineers were already experimenting with reducing not just visual and radar signatures, but acoustic ones as well. The battlefield was beginning to shift toward invisibility, silence, and detection avoidance decades before modern stealth technology fully matured. But the project faced enormous technical obstacles. Creating a genuinely quiet military aircraft, while maintaining performance, range, and operational capability, proved extraordinarily difficult with the technology available at the time. As submarine warfare evolved and alternative detection systems improved, the concept gradually lost momentum. By the 1960s, the program reportedly disappeared into classified archives. Still, the idea remains deeply intriguing because it revealed how early Cold War military research had already started imagining aircraft designed not just to fly unseen, but unheard. Story 32. Giant Hornet sounds exactly like the kind of secret aircraft conspiracy people would dismiss as myth. Yet, Cold War aviation history is filled with highly classified reconnaissance programs that blurred the line between real engineering and science fiction. The Giant Hornet was reportedly conceived as an experimental high-altitude reconnaissance platform, capable of operating at extreme altitudes beyond the reach of many conventional aircraft and defenses. During the Cold War, intelligence gathering became one of the most important priorities on Earth. Nations desperately wanted aircraft capable of spying deep inside enemy territory, while remaining almost impossible to intercept. And that pressure created some astonishing machines. The alleged Giant Hornet concept reportedly focused on altitude, stealth, and long-range surveillance. The aircraft was said to feature highly advanced aerodynamics and lightweight construction techniques intended to allow sustained operations near the edge of the atmosphere, where thin air made conventional flight extremely difficult. At those altitudes, the aircraft would have existed in a strange zone between airplanes and spacecraft. That is what makes these projects feel so futuristic. Many Cold War reconnaissance aircraft already looked decades ahead of their time. Experimental platforms often used exotic materials, unusual wing shapes, and highly secretive propulsion concepts in pursuit of even slight advantages in altitude and speed. But as satellite technology rapidly improved, the strategic value of extremely risky reconnaissance aircraft began to decline. Satellites could photograph enemy territory from orbit continuously without risking pilots or violating airspace in the same direct way. And so many experimental aviation projects quietly vanished. Some were canceled outright. Others were folded into classified research programs. Documentation disappeared into military archives, fueling decades of speculation about what was truly built and tested behind closed doors. That mystery is what gives projects like the Giant Hornet their eerie legacy. During the Cold War, governments pushed aviation technology so aggressively that some experimental aircraft genuinely sounded more like vehicles from the future than machines belonging to the 20th century. Story 33. During the 1950s, the Soviet Union explored a military concept that sounded less like Cold War engineering and more like something ripped from the pages of a retro-futuristic comic book: jet-powered boots for soldiers. The idea was both absurd and strangely ambitious. Military planners imagined infantry equipped with wearable propulsion systems capable of boosting movement speed, leaping over obstacles, crossing dangerous terrain, or maneuvering rapidly during combat. Instead of relying solely on vehicles, engineers experimented with the idea of turning individual soldiers into partially airborne assault units. In theory, the boots used small jet engines attached near the legs or feet to generate thrust. And during testing, the concept actually worked to some extent. Prototype systems reportedly managed to produce enough force to propel users forward or assist with short jumps and movement bursts. Watching a soldier wearing primitive rocket-powered footwear during the 1950s must have looked unbelievably futuristic at the time. But reality quickly revealed why the idea never became practical. Controlling thrust while balancing a human body proved incredibly difficult and dangerous. Fuel capacity remained extremely limited, meaning operation times were very short. The systems were also noisy, unstable, mechanically unreliable, and potentially catastrophic if something malfunctioned during use. And perhaps most importantly, battlefields are chaotic environments. Mud, debris, gunfire, rough terrain, and the sheer unpredictability of combat made delicate wearable propulsion systems far less useful than they appeared on paper. Still, the concept remains fascinating because it perfectly captures the experimental mindset of the Cold War era. Militaries around the world were willing to test almost anything that might provide even a slight tactical advantage, no matter how futuristic or bizarre it sounded. For a brief moment during the 1950s, military engineers genuinely imagined a future where soldiers might charge into battle wearing rocket-powered boots. Story 34. General Dynamics. F-111. Aardvark looked like something engineered specifically to prove that Cold War aircraft designers had completely abandoned normal ideas. Introduced during the 1960s, the jet became famous for one of the strangest and most futuristic features ever placed on a combat aircraft: wings that physically change shape during flight. The system was called variable sweep geometry, though most people simply knew it as the swing wing design. At low speeds, the wings extended outward to provide greater lift and stability for takeoff, landing, and low-altitude flight. But as the aircraft accelerated, the wings swept backward automatically, transforming the jet into a sleeker, high-speed machine optimized for supersonic performance. In essence, the aircraft reshaped itself in mid-air depending on the mission profile. That capability felt astonishingly futuristic at the time. The F-111 was designed as a highly versatile platform capable of performing long-range strike missions, terrain-following low-altitude attacks, strategic bombing, and high-speed penetration into enemy airspace. Advanced radar systems even allowed the aircraft to fly automatically at extremely low altitudes while avoiding terrain at high speed, something that sounded almost impossible during its early years. And visually, the aircraft looked unlike almost anything else in the sky. Watching its wings pivot backward during flight gave the impression of a machine actively transforming itself for combat. But the technology came at a cost. The swing wing mechanism added enormous mechanical complexity, maintenance requirements, and weight. As aviation technology advanced, engineers discovered they could achieve many of the same performance benefits through improved aerodynamics, lightweight materials, and computerized flight systems without physically moving the wings themselves. By the 1980s and beyond, most newer aircraft abandoned the concept entirely. Still, the F-111 remains one of the most fascinating examples of Cold War experimentation, a time when military engineers genuinely built jets capable of morphing their own shape in flight to adapt to different combat conditions. Story 35. Hades bomb concept emerged during one of the most unsettling periods of the Cold War, when military planners began asking a terrifying question. What if nuclear weapons could be made small enough for ordinary battlefield use? During the 1950s and 1960s, both superpowers explored tactical nuclear systems intended not for destroying entire cities, but for direct combat scenarios against troop formations, armored divisions, fortifications, and strategic positions. The idea behind concepts like the Hades bomb was to create compact nuclear devices capable of delivering devastating localized destruction while remaining deployable closer to conventional battlefields. And that is what made the concept so disturbing. Earlier atomic bombs were viewed primarily as civilization-ending strategic weapons. Tactical nuclear systems blurred the line between conventional warfare and nuclear war itself. Military planners began imagining scenarios where commanders might use nuclear devices, almost like oversized artillery shells or battlefield demolition charges. The Hades concept reportedly focused on smaller, more targeted detonations intended to maximize tactical effectiveness while limiting broader destruction compared to large strategic warheads. But the reality remained horrifying. Even relatively small nuclear weapons produce catastrophic heat, radiation, shockwaves, and long-term environmental contamination. The idea of deploying such devices routinely near active combat zones raised enormous ethical and practical concerns. Military strategists also feared escalation. Once any nuclear weapon was used, even on a limited battlefield scale, there was no guarantee conflicts would remain contained. Tactical exchanges could rapidly spiral into full-scale nuclear war between major powers. As public awareness of radiation dangers and environmental damage grew, many experimental concepts surrounding battlefield nuclear warfare gradually lost support or disappeared into classified archives. Still, projects like the Hades bomb revealed just how dangerously normalized nuclear thinking became during parts of the Cold War. For a period of history, military planners seriously explored the possibility of integrating atomic weapons directly into ordinary battlefield operations. Story 36. Ballistic missile submarines became one of the most terrifying military concepts of the Cold War because they transformed the oceans themselves into hidden launch platforms for devastating attacks. During the 1960s, the United States military poured enormous resources into experimental submarine missile systems designed to strike enemy territory without warning, while remaining almost impossible to detect. The logic was brutally simple. If submarines could survive a surprise attack hidden deep underwater, they could guarantee retaliation under almost any circumstance. That made them one of the most important pieces of Cold War nuclear strategy. The technology sounded unbelievably futuristic for the era. Engineers experimented with advanced underwater launch systems, compact missile designs, pressurized launch tubes, and guidance technologies capable of firing ballistic missiles directly from submerged submarines. These vessels could theoretically patrol silently near enemy coastlines for months at a time, carrying weapons capable of reaching targets hundreds or even thousands of miles inland. And unlike bombers or missile silos, submarines were extraordinarily difficult to track. That invisibility was the true weapon. A nation could never fully know where enemy submarines were hiding beneath the oceans, meaning a devastating retaliatory strike might always be possible even after a large-scale attack. The result was a chilling balance of fear, where both superpowers understood that destroying the other completely had become nearly impossible. But developing these systems was incredibly difficult. Launching missiles underwater required solving major engineering problems involving pressure, buoyancy, stabilization, navigation, and propulsion under extreme conditions. Early experimental systems often suffered from reliability issues and technical failures before more advanced designs eventually replaced them. Still, those early Cold War experiments changed warfare forever. Today, ballistic missile submarines remain among the most secretive and powerful military assets on Earth. Silent vessels hidden beneath the oceans, carrying enough firepower to reshape global history without ever revealing their location. Story 37. Long before modern drones became a permanent fixture of warfare, the United States military experimented with a strange surveillance concept that looked surprisingly futuristic for its time: tethered drones. Unlike conventional aircraft, these unmanned systems were designed to remain connected to the ground through cables or tethers while hovering over a specific area for extended periods. The idea was simple but strategically valuable. By staying anchored, the drones could receive continuous power and maintain stable communications without relying heavily on onboard fuel or batteries. That meant they could potentially watch the battlefield for hours or even days at a time. Equipped with cameras and reconnaissance equipment, the tethered aircraft were intended to provide real-time intelligence about troop movements, enemy positions, and activity across contested regions. In many ways, they acted like portable observation towers floating high above the battlefield. At the time, the concept felt remarkably advanced. Military planners were already imagining persistent airborne surveillance decades before modern drones and satellite networks became common. The ability to maintain a constant eye in the sky without risking pilots represented a major shift in reconnaissance strategy. But the systems came with major limitations. The tether restricted mobility, making the drones vulnerable and limiting how far they could operate from their support vehicles or installations. Weather conditions, cable management, and deployment difficulties also created operational headaches. As drone technology rapidly evolved, fully autonomous and untethered UAVs soon offered far greater flexibility, range, and survivability. And so the tethered concepts gradually faded into obscurity. Still, these early experiments revealed how quickly militaries recognized the future importance of continuous surveillance and unmanned systems. Long before sleek combat drones dominated modern warfare, engineers were already experimenting with ways to keep robotic eyes suspended silently above the battlefield for as long as possible. Story 38. During the 1970s, the Soviet Union explored military technologies so unusual they sounded more like experimental robotics projects from the distant future than Cold War weapons programs. One of the strangest concepts reportedly investigated was the so-called snake missile, a flexible weapon designed to move through terrain in ways conventional rockets never could. Instead of flying directly toward a target like a traditional missile, the snake concept aimed to mimic biological movement. Engineers envisioned a weapon capable of slithering across the ground, maneuvering around obstacles, navigating uneven terrain, and approaching targets through unpredictable paths. Inspired by the movement of actual snakes, the missile would theoretically bend and flex while advancing, allowing it to avoid barriers and potentially bypass defensive positions. The idea was both fascinating and unsettling. Traditional missiles followed relatively predictable trajectories. A crawling, terrain-hugging weapon moving autonomously through forests, rubble, trenches, or urban environments would have been far harder to anticipate. And during the Cold War, biomimicry, designing machines inspired by nature, increasingly attracted military interest. Engineers realized evolution had already solved many movement and adaptation problems over millions of years. If animals could navigate difficult terrain efficiently, perhaps machines could imitate those same principles. But reality proved much harsher than theory. Building a reliable missile capable of flexible movement, navigation, propulsion, and guidance, while surviving battlefield conditions, turned out to be enormously complicated. The technology of the era struggled with the precision control systems, materials, and computing power such designs required. As technical difficulties mounted, the project reportedly faded into obscurity and was ultimately abandoned. Still, the Snake missile remains a fascinating glimpse into Cold War experimentation. Even decades ago, military researchers were already imagining weapons that moved less like machines and more like living creatures, blurring the line between biology and warfare in ways that still feel futuristic today.